Hello, and welcome to Kindred Spirits Book Club, the podcast where two grown ladies geek out about Anne of Green Gables. I'm Reagan Duffy, and I'm here with my co-host, Kelly Gerner.
Hey there, Kindred Spirits.
You know, it is now 2026, and we want to wish all of our listeners a very happy new year.
Happy New Year. I'm hoping for a beautiful, bright, fresh new 2026 for all of us.
I love it.
Today, we are joined by one of my dearest friends and an absolutely brilliant scholar, Professor Corey McEleney. Corey McEleney is a professor of English and affiliated faculty in the Women, Gender, and Sexualities program at Fordham University, where his research and teaching focus is on literary and cultural theory, queer studies, and early modern literature. He received his PhD and MA from Brown University and his BA from UCLA. His monograph, Feudal Pleasures, Early Modern Literature and the Limits of Utility, Fordham University Press 2017, which explores the complex role that pleasure plays in early modern and contemporary debates about the value of literature, received an honorable mention in the MLA Prize for a first book competition. He is currently at work on a new book project tentatively titled The Art of Overanalyzing, which examines and critiques the cultural and political implications of the stereotype that professors of literature overanalyze texts to death. Corey, you are in very good company.
Corey, we are so delighted to have you on the pod and for me to finally get a chance to meet you.
Likewise, thank you so much. I'm so grateful for the invitation, and I'm so happy to be here.
Well, we are going to be glad to read your new book project about overanalyzing because I think we might feel seen.
When I was telling a fellow professor about this project, and she said that if she were to write the book, the subtitle would have to be a memoir. So I think a lot of people will feel seen by this if I can get it finished.
So, Reagan, Corey and I have been friends since we were 16 years old. Although many things brought us together, I do think a shared love of discussing a book or an album or a movie to death was among them. So I have to ask, Corey, is overanalyzing at the heart of most of your friendships?
I think that's probably fair to say, especially in the case of our friendship. And I think the operative phrase that you used is shared love, right? Because overanalyzing or just analyzing is so often seen as something that's negative and antisocial. But I've been thinking a lot about something that my very brilliant colleague Jordan Stein wrote in his recent book on Nina Simone. He says that paying careful analytic attention is how I know how to show that I love something. And I think it's also through that kind of attentiveness that we show how we love each other. We don't think enough and we don't talk enough about how our relationships with each other are so often triangulated through cultural objects or even obsessions that we share.
So, Kelly, is this our new thesis statement for the podcast? As we have now spent 80 plus episodes on a single book series?
I think so. I love what you just said, Corey, about you show how much you love something by paying attention to it. And we certainly love these books.
Well, let me just jump in and say that, I think it's beyond impressive what you two are doing. And also incredibly important in an era of book bans and the suppression of the teaching of history. I really believe that it's a real active resistance to nerd out with each other in a public forum about literature and history and gender dynamics and, all of the other amazing topics that you address. And in terms of the 81 episodes, I also have to confess that I'm a little envious because I think in many ways you two are living the dream that many teachers of literature have, but that we can never actually fulfill given the constraints of the academic calendar. So I would love to have the chance to have 81 class sessions and counting examining particular author book series from a multiplicity of different angles, if only. So all the power to you. And another thing that I wanted to say that is that I'm also really grateful to you for showcasing the work of the scholars that you've had on. We're living in a moment when academia is increasingly under attack based on these really grotesquely reductive stereotypes that were irrelevant and out of touch at best and satanic at worst. So you're providing a really important and generous venue for the kind of work that many of us do.
Having academics and scholars on this podcast, I think, has been such a turning point for us in the discussions that we're able to have, because Reagan and I are readers and lovers of these texts. And I mean, I think we're bright ladies, but we don't have just the level of education that someone like yourself, Corey, or someone like Laura Robinson, someone like Kate Scarth, who we're going to have on later this season. You know, these are people who are deeply embedded in this field of study, who know this work inside and out, and being able to bring their expertise just makes our conversation so much richer, so much more dynamic, gives us so much more context. And I think we are like then able to pass all that on to our listeners. Like, what a wonderful gift. You know, this podcast is free. It's floating out there on the internet. Anyone can listen to these absolute titans in their fields talk about this material. And I'm just really happy that we're able to do that.
Well, thank you.
Okay, so Corey, as we said in our introduction, one of your areas of scholarship is literature from the early modern period. When people ask me about my friend Professor McEleney, I just say that you're a Shakespeare professor, but it's much more expansive than that, right? So what are you teaching the kids?
I mean, Shakespeare's my guy, so that's a label I would never ever refuse. But I've always considered myself to be more of a generalist at heart. In recent years, I've taught everything from the Canterbury Tales to Crazy Ex-Girlfriend. Especially in the last decade or so, as critical race theory and queer theory have come under attack from the right, I've felt almost kind of an ethical obligation to shift my teaching and my research in that direction too. But I'll always have at least a few toes, if not a whole foot, in Shakespeare studies and the Renaissance.
So Corey, Rilla of Ingleside is your first time reading Ella Montgomery, right?
I do remember reading Anne of Green Gables when I was younger and really enjoying it. So not exactly, but it's been a long time.
It's been a long time.
I kind of realize now in hindsight that this wasn't an interest that I felt I could pursue, and certainly not advertise. And so I think that as a closeted gay boy, I became convinced that the Green Gables books were books for girls. And, you know, I regret the fact that I didn't read more of them or return to them. So I'm thankful to you both for kind of reintroducing me to this world.
I'm sorry for all the boys and young men out there who haven't had a chance to read these books because of the patriarchy. It hurts all of us, not just women.
It's true.
So we're privileged to bring you back and have you at our table. Corey, what did you make of Rilla of Ingleside?
I loved it. I thought it was so moving and so gut-wrenching, but also really funny. I really admired the way that Montgomery kind of veers almost imperceptibly between comedy and tragedy, between satire and sincerity. Also, the way she shifts between little intimate domestic details and then these events of world historical importance. I also thought that the use of free and direct discourse rivaled that of even Austen. I don't know, reading it, it kind of felt like Northanger Abbey meets Mrs. Dalloway in a way.
You say Northanger Abbey and Mrs. Dalloway. I felt Emma and Mrs. Dalloway were sort of where this novel meets, but yeah.
I could see that too, for sure. And as for Walter Blythe, maybe it's just narcissistic identification, but when it said that he wants to be a professor of English literature in some big college, I was instantly attached.
Well, there's a reason we wanted you to come on this episode.
Thank you.
Well, before we get into the bulk of our conversation, quick business, listeners.
On our Instagram at kindredspirits.bookclub, we share gorgeous book photos, news about new and adaptations, and updates from the world of Ella Montgomery scholarship. And if you are feeling inspired by our editions of Anne of Green Gables and are looking for a place to build out your own Ella Montgomery library, may we recommend the Kindred Spirits Book Club storefront at bookshop.org.
We love bookshop.org because every sale supports local independent bookstores. So important.
We've put a link in our show notes that will take you right there, and you can see many of our favorite editions alongside some of our other book recommendations. If you purchase from that link, we do get a small kickback, so it's also a great way to support indie bookstores and our show.
And finally, the very best way to support our show is to show us some love with a review and a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Pocket Casts, wherever you listen. If they have a rating or a review system, we would appreciate it so much. And now on to our episode. Our kindred spirit of the episode today is Walter Blythe. Walter is Anne and Gilbert's second son, and if their firstborn son is the chivalric knight of the family, Walter is the romantic poet. Walter's character arc in Rilla of Ingleside is profoundly moving, as it follows him from a sensitive, anxious young man who attempts to avoid the conflict altogether to an acclaimed war hero whose poetry and sacrifice came to define the moral imperative of the war for the other characters in the book. And our quote of the episode comes from Walter's last letter to his little sister Rilla, which he wrote the night before he died in battle, and which she received posthumously. So, Corey, we'd love to invite you to read our quote of the episode.
I would be honored. Thank you. Rilla, you know I've always had premonitions. You remember the Pied Piper. But no, of course you wouldn't. You were too young. One evening long ago, when Nan and Di and Jem and the Merediths and I were together in Rainbow Valley, I had a queer vision or presentiment, whatever you like to call it. Rilla, I saw the Piper coming down the valley with a shadowy host behind him. The others thought I was only pretending, but I saw him for just one moment. And Rilla, last night I saw him again. I was doing sentry go and I saw him marching across no man's land from our trenches to the German trenches, the same tall, shadowy form, piping weirdly, and behind him followed boys in khaki. Rilla, I tell you I saw him. It was no fancy, no illusion. I heard his music and then he was gone. But I had seen him and I knew what it meant. I knew that I was among those who followed him.
Whew. It is such a chilling passage. And I think that this is really true to the way Maud characterizes Walter as someone who is almost coming from another plane of existence. He's experiencing this war not just on sort of a normal human level, but also on this like quasi-spiritual level.
Absolutely.
I can't wait to get into all of that more in this episode. Our story club today is all about our lovely poet, the otherworldly Walter Blythe, and we have a ton to talk about today. Both his beautiful and heartbreaking plot arc in the book, but also the symbol that he comes to represent and why that was so important for Maud to write Walter as both part of the world and apart from the world. Of all the complicated and compelling narratives in Rilla of Ingleside, we think Walter's is the most profound.
I would agree. I mean, I think that Walter's arc is this through line throughout the book that both grounds us in kind of conscience and also is the most tragic and heartbreaking. It really comes to symbolize the tragedy of war.
Yeah. But first, all the content warnings for this episode, you guys. Kindred spirits, as always, we hope you are taking care of yourself first. So if discussions of death and violence are not what you need to be listening to right now, please feel free to skip this episode or pause it and come back to it when you are able. Walter's arc in Rilla of Ingleside is fascinating to us because it's one of the few perspectives in this book that gives us a more nuanced view of the moral and psychological toll of World War I. We've talked about how so much of this book is this idea of heroism, of being a hero. And that takes many forms, right? Whether it's Jem who is enlisting at the very first moment, or whether that's Rilla fostering the war baby Jims, or whether that's Susan working out in the fields instead of in the kitchen. There's little discussion, though, about what war actually is and what it means to sacrifice our youth and our bodies for a political cause. There's little discussion about what level of violence war demands and how that changes us as humans. We really just have Walter. Walter is the conscience of Rilla of Ingleside, and he's the one who is doing the work of challenging and humanizing that narrative of easy heroism. Walter's reluctance to enlist helps convey that true horror of war, at least as much as Ella Montgomery understood it when she was writing. Unlike his older brother Jem, Walter is not driven by adventure alone. He is keenly aware of that ugliness and brutality of military conflict. He envisions being, quote, torn and mangled on a battlefield. He imagines bayoneting another human being. He thinks about long-term effects like losing his sight. He's engaging with this on a very visceral level. And that's such an important counterpoint to Jem and Jerry Meredith cavalier, we're going to go out and pot some Huns perspective. And Walter ultimately does decide to enlist, which then asks us as readers to consider a different kind of hero. Someone who understands that he is making a terrible bargain, someone who understands how bad it's going to be, but who does it anyway, not out of a sense of the great adventure of it all, but from a sense of moral responsibility to preserve a way of life that he cherishes and values. So for Walter, enlisting is not just about patriotism, it's about what he defines triumph over evil. Walter in this book is also a proxy for wartime poets like John McCrae, whose poem In Flanders Field came to symbolize the sacrifices made by Canadian soldiers in World War I. Walter in this book writes a poem called The Piper, which is part call to arms, but also part warning, and that's inspired by his childhood prophecy of a piper who would call for him and his brothers and take them far away from Canada. So you guys, this is a lot. This is a lot to lay on Walter's shoulders, right? He is doing such heavy lifting in this book. So that's what we're talking about today. Let's get into it. Let's see how Maud added nuance and conscience to an otherwise very pro-war book through Walter Blythe.
So let's talk a little bit about what we know about Walter before Rilla of Ingleside starts.
I'll be very grateful for this discussion.
So when we first meet Walter in Anne of Ingleside, it is on the eve of his baby sister Rilla's birth, although Walter doesn't know it yet. And Walter is being sent with no real explanation to the Parkers' house to be out of the way during the birth. Walter is 6 years old. He's sensitive, observant, with a poet's soul and a vivid imagination. He's afraid to go upstairs in the dark, and he frequently scares himself with his own fancies. Opinions on young Walter are both negative. Per Aunt Mary Maria, he's, quote, far too nervous and high-strung, and positive. Kitty McGregor, who reportedly had the second sight, said that Walter is an old soul in a young body. And Maud tells us, quote, it might be that the old soul knew too much for the young brain to understand always. If you remember from Anne of Ingleside, Walter did not have a great time at the Parkers' house. The rough and tumble Parker clan susses out immediately that Walter is sensitive and starts teasing him. They think in good fun, but it absolutely pierces Walter's soul. And they eventually work up to speculating that his mother, Anne, is dying and will be dead before Walter gets home. Walter is so convinced by this that he sneaks out in the middle of the night and walks 6 miles back home. He is absolutely petrified the entire walk. It's freezing. It's pitch black. But the idea that his mother might be dying strengthens his spine, and he gallantly faces his overwhelming fears, walks for 3 hours to get home. When he arrives home, his tiny knock at the door isn't heard, baby being born and all. So he goes to sleep in the barn until dawn. Walter's fears were unfounded, of course, as Anne is fine, and even better, there's a new baby sister. But we see even this early how Walter's imagination goes to the worst possible outcome in the most vivid, visceral way possible. And though he consistently doubts his courage, comparing his fears to what he imagines would be Jem's brazen confidence in that same moment, Walter still does the hard thing.
I would say that this scene is sort of marvelous foreshadowing for Walter in Rilla of Ingleside, but as we know, Maud wrote Rilla of Ingleside before Anne of Ingleside, so foiled again by these interpals.
So the other important thing from Anne of Ingleside is that when Anne is checking on all of her children sleeping in their beds, this is what she sees when she checks on Walter. Quote, Walter was smiling in his sleep as someone who knew a charming secret. The moon was shining on his pillow through the bars of the leaded window, casting the shadow of a clearly defined cross on the wall above his head. In long after years, Anne was to remember that and wonder if it were an omen of Courcelette, of a cross-marked grave somewhere in France. But tonight, it was only a shadow, nothing more.
Which, I mean, when I say that Maud took every opportunity to foreshadow, she absolutely did.
In Rainbow Valley, which was written before Rilla of Ingleside, of all of the Ingleside children, we get to know 12-year-old Walter the best of them. Walter is frequently found reading poetry and telling fanciful stories. He gives the trees and other landmarks poetic names. He has a passionate love of beauty and nature that makes him dreamy and sensitive. The other Rainbow Valley kids love him, but they don't always know what to make of him. The kids at school tend to think of him as girly and soft because he avoids fighting and prefers reading poetry over joining in on school sports. He is mostly left alone due to Jem's popularity and Jem's willingness to throw down for his brother. And Walter has earned a sort of grudging respect for his ability to, quote, talk book talk. We see that Walter's primary arc in Rainbow Valley has to do with his fear of ugliness and fighting and pain. About halfway through the book, Walter is in frequent pain over an intense toothache, but doesn't want to go to the dentist to get it pulled for fear of the pain and bleeding. He and Faith Meredith have this conversation about it. Quote, the bleeding is worst of all. It's so ugly, cried Walter. It just made me sick when Jem cut his foot last summer, but I couldn't bear to see Jem hurt either. Somebody's always getting hurt, Faith, and it's awful. I just can't bear to see things hurt. It makes me want to run and run and run till I can't hear or see them. There's no use making fuss over anyone getting hurt, said Faith, tossing her curls. Of course, if you've hurt yourself very bad, you have to yell, and blood is messy. And I don't like seeing other people hurt either. But I don't want to run. I want to go to work and help them.
And this, of course, is really clever foreshadowing for Faith, who ends up going to work in England with the VAD. Well, shortly after that conversation, the bully Dan Reese teases Faith at school in front of Walter. And Faith in no way expected Walter to defend her honor in a fistfight with Dan. Quote, she would as soon have expected a starry-eyed young angel to pummel dirty, freckled Dan Reese for her as Walter Blythe. Walter knows that Jem would have avenged Faith, and he's deeply ashamed that Faith had been insulted in his presence and he didn't do anything about it. Quote, Walter couldn't fight. He hated the idea. It was rough and painful, and worst of all, it was ugly. He never could understand Jem's exultation in an occasional conflict, but he wished he could fight Dan Reese. A few days later at school, Dan doubles down on insults to Faith and then throws in some insults for Walter as well, chanting at him that he's a coward and insulting Walter's mom because some things never change. At this point, Walter has had enough. He screws up his courage and he launches himself at Dan, knocking him off the fence. Before Dan can fight back, the school bell rings and they agree that they're going to fight the next night. As Walter's righteous anger fades, his imagination ramps up and he can't stop thinking about how much a fight might hurt. After school, the boys and an audience, of course, gather in the spruce wood. Faith ties her ribbon around Walter's arm, and suddenly, Walter is extremely calm. At the last moment, his fear had vanished, but he still felt disgust at the idea of fighting. Dan hits Walter in the face, and the pain does something to Walter. Quote, something such as he had never experienced before seemed to roll over him like a flood. His face flushed crimson, his eyes burned like flame. The scholars of Glen St. Mary's School had never dreamed that Miss Walter could look like that. He hurled himself forward and closed Dan like a young wildcat. Walter fought with savage fury and a joy in the struggle against which Dan could not hold his ground. All of a sudden, Walter finds himself kneeling over Dan, whose nose is bleeding spectacularly. Walter makes Dan take all his words back, but he does find all the spilled blood awful. Walter takes off for Rainbow Valley. Quote, he felt none of a victor's joy, but he felt a certain calm satisfaction in duty done and honor avenged, mingled with a sickish qualm when he thought of Dan's gory nose. It had been so ugly, and Walter hated ugliness. As he goes through Rainbow Valley, Walter runs into Mr. Meredith, the preacher, who picks up from Walter's injuries that he had been fighting. Walter shares that he had been defending Faith and his mother and asks if it's right to fight. Mr. Meredith says, not always, and not often, but sometimes. Yes, sometimes. My motto, Walter, is don't fight till you're sure you ought to, and then put every ounce of you into it. Walter says, I was a whole lot frightened, but I'm not going to be frightened anymore, sir. Being frightened of things is worse than the things themselves. I'm going to ask Father to take me over to Lowbridge tomorrow to get my tooth out.
And we're talking about this in detail because this incident is such early foreshadowing of Walter's internal conflict in Rilla of Ingleside.
And it's not just that his deep loathing for pain, suffering, violence, and gore are foreshadowed early on, but also that deep sense of justice, right? For avenging the weak when they have been wronged by the strong. And that is just as prominently defined. And those are the two sensibilities that are at war within him, both as a child and in this book. This hatred of pain and violence is always in conflict with his inherent abhorrence of injustice. Inside Walter is an avenging angel, but one who is not wholly comfortable brandishing his flaming sword. Corey, so that's kind of like Walter's background before Rilla of Ingleside, and I wonder how that impacts your read.
It really does. It actually kind of deepens my sense of how inevitable his trajectory feels. Within Montgomery's fictional world, but also within the broader cultural scripts that kind of shaped the young men of his generation, right? Knowing his backstory, it really makes him feel even more like a very specific kind of young man that the war was especially hard on. The ones who are introspective and idealistic and dreamy. And it's interesting because, although it's also complicated, because now I'm inclined to see his enlistment not as I initially did, which was kind of a sudden change or break from who he was. I wanted to reach into the fictional world and scream at him don't do it, right? But instead it feels, knowing this backstory, it feels like something his childhood kind of almost portends.
Yeah. Montgomery knows when she is writing Rainbow Valley that these boys will be going to war.
I think this backstory makes me realize that in a kind of counterintuitive way, the same qualities that make him gentle and thoughtful in peacetime are ultimately the ones that leave him feeling morally compelled to go to war, even though he fears what the war will do to him.
I think the other thing that really gets to the inevitability and another seed that Maud is planting early are his prophecies and premonitions, right?
Yeah. So Walter has 2 premonitions in Rainbow Valley. And the first is quite early on in the book. The kids are in Rainbow Valley. They're discussing some of the stories that Walter had been reading out loud to them. Quote, "Someday," said Walter dreamily, looking afar into the sky, "the Pied Piper will come over the hill up there and down Rainbow Valley, piping merrily and sweetly, and I will follow him down to the shore, down to the sea, away from you all. I don't think I'll want to go. Jem will want to go. It will be such an adventure, but I won't. Only I'll have to. The music will call and call and call me until I must follow." At this moment, Di yells that they will all go, caught up in Walter's story. "No, you'll sit here and wait," said Walter, his great splendid eyes full of strange glamour. "You'll wait for us to come back, and we may not come, for we cannot come as long as the piper plays. He may pipe us round the world, and still you'll sit here and wait and wait."
I've read this so many times, and I still got a chill when you read that out loud, Reagan.
This is a spooky, eerie premonition. And Walter has a, quote, "queer little chill of some mysterious dread. The Pied Piper had seemed very real to him, as if the fluttering veil that hid the future had for a moment been blown aside in the starlit dusk of Rainbow Valley, and some dim glimpse of coming years granted to him." So it's an eerie moment, and it underscores the hideousness that we've been talking about, not just of the boys being led away to this unknown fate, but how awful it is for the girls to have to sit and do nothing but wait. Walter's second premonition comes at the very end of the book. Yet again, the kids are all gathered in Rainbow Valley, this time on the eve of Jem's departure for Queen's Academy. This moment is happening at the end of kind of their merry band of children as they start to grow up. Quote, "Walter began to speak dreamily, partly because he wanted to thrill his companions a little, partly because something apart from him seemed to be speaking through his lips. 'The Piper is coming nearer,' he said. 'He is nearer than he was that evening I saw him before. His long shadowy cloak is blowing round him. He pipes, and we must follow, Jem and Carl and Jerry and I, round and round the world. Listen, listen, can't you hear his wild music?' And to this, Jem jumps up and says, 'Let the Piper come and welcome. I'll follow him gladly, round and round the world.'" And that's the last sentence in Rainbow Valley. It is an ominous note to end the book on, a book that otherwise is full of childish exploits, small town vignettes, and some good old-fashioned family dysfunction. But Maud's readers would know to what she is referring, because Rainbow Valley was published in 1919. And at that moment, the wound of World War I had barely begun to heal. They would know that Walter's premonitions are not just the product of childish imaginations, and they would understand that these innocent young kids will be faced with an unimaginable crisis in just a few years. So, Corey, hearing these premonitions, what do you make of those going into Rilla of Ingleside?
Well, it really helps me understand the context of his poem, The Piper, of course, which is harkening back to those premonitions. But I also there in that quote you just read, there was a little detail that I just absolutely loved when at the start it says Walter began to speak dreamily, partly because he wanted to thrill his companions a little. I mean, it's just like a little throwaway line that's kind of passed over on the way to the next clause, which is partly because something apart from him seemed to be speaking through his lips, which implies this kind of otherworldliness. But that initial detail is so great because, you know, he's a storyteller. You know, he's an artist. He's aware of his audience. He's aware of what will affect them. I love it. It's so subtle, but it really speaks volumes about him as a character.
It also kind of brings him back into the world of the real, right?
Mm-hmm.
Maud is doing so much work to sort of elevate Walter in this sort of like prophetic moment. But you're so right, Corey, with that little line. He is still just a little boy having fun with his playmates.
Exactly.
All right, so that the groundwork having been laid, let's talk about Rilla of Ingleside. When this book starts, we begin with our little gossip crew, our sort of Greek chorus of Anne, Miss Cornelia, and Susan, and they're giving everybody the background on what's happening with all the Blythe kids. So we learn that Walter is 20 years old. At this point, he's been teaching at the school in Lowbridge for the past 2 years, but he will be going to Redmond College in the fall. He has had a very bad bout of typhoid and is still recovering. Now, this typhoid for Walter was a close shave, so everybody is a little bit concerned that he's not really strong enough to go to Redmond just yet, but he is determined to go. Walter is already a poet. Miss Oliver, she knows that he has written some remarkable sequence of sonnets dedicated to Rosamond, and it's implied that those are really about Faith Meredith. And Walter's ambition at this point is to become a professor of English literature.
Walter is Rilla's favorite sibling. Walter doesn't tease her like Jem and Shirley. Rilla wishes that Walter confided in her as much as he does in Di, and she laments that Walter thinks she is too young to understand everything yet. As soon as the prospect of war is introduced, we see the stark difference between Jem and Walter. Jem is excited. Oh boy, he literally says, oh boy. Germany has declared war on France. This means England will fight too. And if she does, well, the piper of your old fancy will have come at last. In response, it wasn't a fancy, said Walter slowly. It was a presentiment, a vision. Jem, I really saw him for a moment that evening long ago. Suppose England does fight. And after Jem goes whistling away, Walter's left staring out at nothingness, thinking, quote, war was a hellish, horrible, hideous thing, too horrible and hideous to happen in the 20th century between civilized nations. The mere thought of it was hideous and made Walter unhappy in its threat to the beauty of life. Walter's not wrong. War is hellish, horrible, and hideous, and unbecoming of a modern civilization. It was true then, it's just as true now. And unfortunately, we don't seem to be learning from these lessons of the past.
This is just really making me think of Walter very specifically as a poet and an artist in his role as like a creator. He is someone who feels called to add beauty to the world. And so in that sense, war is like the anti-Walter. It's the anti-artist, anti-poet, anti-creator. War is the destroyer, right? It's the ender of life. So I think you can read this line as Walter just sort of objecting to the physical ugliness of violent conflict. I also think it reads as a sort of statement of Walter's values as a creative.
Well, I think the other thing about the way that Walter is setting up here, already thinking about the hideousness and the ugliness of war, and the way that that is an anathema to his beauty-loving soul, is it sets up that the only way he could participate in the ugliness of war is if there was an even higher calling than beauty to justify participating in destruction, right?
I think that's spot on. And even in a way, that higher calling, he has to conceive of it as its own kind of beauty, right? Yeah. And that's the only way he can reconcile that contradiction.
So as we know, of course, England does declare war on Germany and Canadian men are called to enlist. We discussed in our previous episode that Jem and Jerry Meredith enlist straight away. Interestingly, for our conversation, there's no expectation that Walter is going to join them. He is of age, but as we discussed, he's in weakened health after his bout of typhoid. At this point, when Jem is first enlisting, there's no real discussion. There's no conversation among the Blythes about whether enlisting is right or whether the war itself is right. Of course, they're naturally worried for the safety of their son and for Jerry and for all the men and boys of their village, but they're not really wrestling with the moral implications of enlisting, except for Walter. Now, Walter, of course, feels deeply conflicted right from the start. A week after the declaration of war, he comes across Rilla in Rainbow Valley. I envy Jem, said Walter moodily. Envy Jem? Oh, Walter, you don't want to go too? No, said Walter, gazing straight before him down the emerald vistas of the valley. No, I don't want to go. That's just the trouble, Rilla. I'm afraid to go. I'm a coward. You're not, Rilla burst out angrily. Why, anybody would be afraid to go. You might be killed. I wouldn't mind that if it didn't hurt, muttered Walter. I don't think I'm afraid of death itself. It's the pain that might come before death. It wouldn't be so bad to die and have it over, but to keep on dying. Rilla, I've always been afraid of pain. You know that. I can't help it. I shudder when I think of the possibility of being mangled or blinded. Rilla, I cannot face that thought. To be blind? Never to see the beauty of the world again? I ought to go. I ought to want to go, but I don't. I hate the thought of it. I'm ashamed. Ashamed. My God, I so hate that he feels this much shame in this moment. Like, there's nothing to be ashamed of. It is normal, it is human not to want to experience or cause or even witness this kind of pain and suffering. So this is where we see Walter is really mired in this internal struggle because he has this more realistic understanding of the war. Instead of enlisting for the thrill of adventure and patriotism, Walter is focused on the pain that might precede death, and he's tortured by the idea of taking a life. He has a beautiful conscience. I really appreciate that Maud brought in this perspective. At the time she was writing the book and at the time her readers were experiencing the war, there was so much wartime propaganda that made enlisting as a soldier seem like the only correct path. And that propaganda completely erased or glossed over the very real danger and the brutality of what soldiers are commanded to do. So for Maud to show Walter reckoning with that outside of the propaganda, I think that was incredibly brave. And it's what makes this book really special. It's what gives this book a more nuanced and humane perspective. It's what I think makes this book more dimensional than just sort of like a pro-war, off to pot some Huns kind of book. This is really a terrible moment for Walter, but a wonderful moment for this book.
Walter is also really falsely comparing himself to Jem. He always does that throughout all of the books. And he has this sort of false understanding of bravery and courage,
Yep.
Right? We saw in that moment in Anne of Ingleside when he's walking home in the dark, he assumes that Jem's brazenness means that Jem would not be afraid in that moment, where I'm fairly sure that 8-year-old Jem would also be afraid walking 6 miles home in the pitch dark. But he thinks that Jem never feels fear, and therefore that's what makes Jem brave. Walter isn't a coward for being afraid of the war. He's judging himself harshly for not wanting to go to war. Not just that he's not enlisting, but that he doesn't want to enlist. And of course, we could argue that wanting to go to war like Jem at the start of the novel isn't actually especially brave. And while Jem might place a higher value on like the patriotic aspect of it, of defending England and France, and that partially informs his decision, Jem is also kind of callous at the thought of causing death to others and doesn't seem like he actually has a good understanding of how horrific fighting in a war will actually be. Walter's not a coward. He's more fully aware of the scope and cost of war than Jem.
Jem seems a lot more comfortable with like dehumanizing the German soldiers than Walter is even capable of being.
I think that's true. And it's all the more remarkable given the fact that this is published just after the war. You know, if I didn't know anything about the publication dates, I would assume that this was written like decades afterward when you have that kind of 2020 hindsight and can really think about those patriotic ideals from a more critical perspective. But, you know, it's so obvious that through Walter, Montgomery is wrestling in real time with those issues.
Well, after Jem goes to war, Walter begins his course of study at Redmond College. And here is where his story begins to get really difficult, because while Walter is at home, the folks in Glen St. Mary aren't necessarily pressuring him to enlist. And whether that's because they know that Jem has already enlisted, and at this point it feels like a family should not have to give more than one son, whether it's because they also know about Walter's recent health history and assume that he is not physically well enough to go, or whether it's just because they all remember him of the gentle and sensitive boy that he was, it doesn't really say. But any pressure for Walter to join the war in the beginning of the book seems to be coming from Walter's own internal sense of duty, his own wrestling with his conscience. But once he's in Kingsport at Redmond, in a new community that doesn't have the same understanding of who he is or where he's from, Walter begins to experience that external pressure to enlist. At Redmond, he was anonymously sent a white feather, a symbol of cowardice, and he wrote to Rilla about it saying, "I deserved it, Rilla. I felt that I ought to put it on and wear it, proclaiming myself to all Redmond the coward I know I am. Some days I almost make up my mind to do it, and then I see myself thrusting a bayonet through another man, some woman's husband or sweetheart or son, perhaps the father of little children. I see myself lying alone, torn and mangled, burning with thirst on a cold, wet field, surrounded by dead and dying men. And I know I never can. I can't face even the thought of it. How could I face the reality? There are times when I wish I had never been born. Life has always seemed such a beautiful thing to me, and now it is a hideous thing.
Oof.
Yeah, so now his struggle is internal, and there's this external component to it that was previously all in Walter's mind. And now with this external pressure, it's confirming all of the worst thoughts he's had about himself.
Yeah, and at least he's weighing it, he's considering it, he's debating it. It's so often overthinking is seen as hindering action. But what war does is it heightens this kind of shoot first, think later mentality. It's all about action without analysis, acting first, with all the gruesome kind of consequences that follow from that. What's so interesting about Walter as a character is that he's thinking first, shooting later. And that makes his decision more informed. It makes it more, it's not a thoughtless act. It's not a thoughtless decision. It's something that a lot of thought and careful analysis went into.
Corey, I love that you circled back to over-analysis. I wasn't thinking about that with Walter at all, but of course that's exactly what he's doing. It has consumed his thoughts to the extent that it's real before it's even happened.
Yes, exactly. And in a culture that doesn't value thinking at all, never mind overthinking, that's no small thing.
So Walter does manage to finish out his first year at Redmond. Now, Walter's mood is very dark, and Rilla does notice that there are moments when his gloom seems to lift, especially as he appreciates the natural beauty of a Prince Edward Island spring, but any mention of the war will plunge him right back into deep melancholy. On May 7th, 1915, a German U-boat torpedoed the RMS Lusitania, a civilian ocean liner. 1,197 people aboard the ship were killed, more than half of those sailing. This was a critical moment for many citizens who had previously been hesitant to support this war, and among them, Walter. For Walter, after the Lusitania, he realized that his fear of violence, if indulged, would destroy him morally. He felt that the war was morally justified, that an enemy willing to sink a civilian ship was a danger to the beautiful community that he loved. So Walter decided he had to go, not just for the patriotic reasons that inspired Jem, but, quote, for my own sake, to save my soul alive. He determined that letting his soul, quote, shrink to something small and mean and lifeless would be worse than blindness or mutilation. Now, Corey, you had said earlier that Walter's decision to go felt abrupt and sort of wrong on first reading, but that with some of the context of his early life, it made a little bit more sense. I would love for you to kind of share with us, as you were reading the book and this moment came upon us, sort of what were your real-time reactions as a reader?
I mean, my heart just sank. Montgomery is so good at getting us so attached to Walter. In general, it's hard not to feel a kind of almost paternal instinct toward him, or maternal instinct toward him, as the case may be, and wanting him to, not make that decision, and to reassure him that all of his hesitation is totally valid, as you've pointed out. A lot of mixed feelings at that moment.
Definitely one of those moments where you want to reach through the book and say, not you too.
Yeah.
So decision made, Walter's entire demeanor changes. And this is fascinating to me because for the first time in the book, now he is relaxed and at ease. Having made the choice, now he is ready for whatever it brings. It's like making that decision has restored his sense of self, has restored his dignity, and his self-respect comes back. It even allows him to write poetry again. Walter tells his sister that he was going to fight for the preservation of the beauty of life. And he says to Rilla, I couldn't live any longer on such terms with myself as I have been since the Lusitania was sunk. When I pictured those dead women and children floating about in that pitiless ice-cold water, well, at first I just felt a sort of nausea with life. I wanted to get out of the world where such a thing could happen, shake its accursed dust from my feet forever. Then I knew I had to go. I'm going for my own sake, to save my soul alive. It will shrink to something small and mean and lifeless if I don't go. That would be worse than blindness or mutilation or any of the things I've feared. You may be killed. Rilla hated herself for saying it. It's not death I fear. I told you that long ago. One can pay too high a price for mere life, little sister. I'm going to fight for the beauty of life, Rilla, my Rilla. That is my duty. this speech. There is so much going on here. When he says he wants to shake the accursed dust from his feet forever after the Lusitania, he's like, I can't live in a world where this happens.
I was thinking about that specifically with that line, but bringing to mind the Walter that is in battle is clearly a Walter that wants to die to a certain degree. Having seen the awfulness of life, it's overcome what he thought was beautiful about life, and he almost can't live with this world. So he's going to do his best to make it better, but he's not planning to continue to live in a world where this type of thing could happen.
I think that's there, Reagan. I think that's there. I mean, I don't think we want to believe that of Walter because we love him so much, but I think that's in the text. What do you make of this speech? Do we believe Walter? Do we think he's right?
I personally don't. Well, I mean, it's complicated, right? I think that Montgomery is really trying to convince us of his reasoning, but I also wonder if Walter even believes this. Maybe it's just reading between the lines, but it seems like a very kind of convenient solution to the conflict that he's been suffering. In that regard, I was really, really struck by that line that one can pay too high a price for mere life, like as if life were mere, right? Not only because it shows that for Walter, he's convinced himself that simply surviving isn't enough, but also because I think it really captures the predicament that a lot of young men faced during that moment when they're being told that honor and patriotism, and implicitly the deaths that so often follow from those values, are more important and more valuable than life itself. That's a hard pill to swallow. And it's certainly a conflict that we see playing out in the wars and genocides of our current moment. So, I don't know if I have a hot take on this passage so much as to say that it's just kind of resonant in so many ways.
It makes me think also a little bit about Rilla does some propaganda speeches to help enlist men and challenging the men. Is there a better death than to die for like the temples of your fathers or something like that is a line where, again, that almost seems like that's part of this propaganda.
Maud is saying that out of one side of her mouth, but the other side, and I think truly like the bulk of her writing, shows us that for Maud, there is no such thing as mere life. She writes these books that are deeply sensory, these books that are all about, experiencing the beauty of the natural world. There's no mere about that. I mean, that's what she's doing here. That's not what that's not what she's writing about, right? It's like she's belied by her own writing, I think. And even in this book, mere life, and yet here's Rilla's biggest contribution to the war is saving a baby. We will do a lot for mere life. That's what makes Rilla a hero. I think this is a book that is often in conflict with itself, which is what makes it a great book and a great discussion.
So before Walter leaves Ingleside for the front, he soaks it all in. Quote, Walter looked about him lingeringly and lovingly. Phantoms of memory seemed to pace the dappled paths. Jem and Jerry, bare-legged, sunburned schoolboys. Nan and Di and Faith in their dimpled, fresh-eyed, childish beauty. Una, the sweet and shy. Carl, poring over ants and bugs. Little slangy, sharp-tongued, good-hearted Mary Vance. The old Walter that had been himself lying on the grass, reading poetry and wandering through palaces of fancy. They were all there around him. He could see them almost as plainly as he saw Rilla, as plainly as he had once seen the Pied Piper piping down the valleys in a vanished twilight. And they said to him, those gay little ghosts of other days, we were the children of yesterday, Walter. Fight a good fight for the children of today and tomorrow. Walter has an ability to perceive out of time. He can perceive present and past together. He gets flashes of the future.
Walter needs to be kind of apart from the world in order to question war the way he does in this book. I think that this is, to some extent, Maud being able to insert some of these perhaps more controversial perspectives on the war through a character who she is sort of setting up to be like almost divine in a way. People were in favor of this war when it was happening. People thought it was a noble and just war. And so for Maud to have her Walter character ask so many questions about it and struggle with it the way he does, I think it's important for her to set him up as a bit of an other in order to get that perspective in.
I almost think it goes a little bit to this idea that I think it's inevitable that Walter doesn't survive war because he is in touch with this higher spiritual plane. He is not earthly enough to a certain degree to experience this hideousness and then be able to come back to a normal life.
Right. So Walter enlists, and the Ingleside folks see him off at the station grimly. As much as they smiled bravely for Jem, they can't quite muster it for Walter. The wrongness of Walter at war is settling on all of them. And the two younger boys, Carl Meredith and Shirley, they send off Walter with this assurance that they're going to meet him there as soon as they're old enough, which is just so chilling. Once at the front, Walter proved his courage, earning a Distinguished Conduct Medal, they call it a DC medal, for rescuing a wounded comrade. While Walter doesn't tell them exactly what he did to earn that award, Jerry Meredith wrote home and informed them that Walter had rescued a wounded soldier from no man's land, that battlefield between the trenches, and taken him back to the relative safety of their trench. And so it's very clear to us at this point that Walter has internalized that advice he received from Reverend Meredith those many years ago. Don't fight until you're sure you ought to, and then put every ounce of you into it. Rilla, of course, is full of pride for her brave brother, and she writes in her diary, quote, "It was her dear Walter who had done this thing. Walter, to whom someone had sent a white feather at Redmond. It was Walter who had dashed back from the safety of the trench to drag in a wounded comrade who had fallen on no man's land. And he hadn't thought it worthwhile writing about it. His letter was full of other things, little intimate things that they two had known and loved together in the dear old cloudless days of a century ago. I've been thinking about the daffodils in the garden at Ingleside," he wrote. "By the time you get this, they will be out blowing under that lovely rosy sky. Are they as bright and golden as ever, Rilla? It seems to me that they must be dyed red with blood, like our poppies here." So Walter's body, his physical body, is in France fighting this terrible war, but his mind and his heart are at home. And his poet's eye can't help but notice the bright red poppies dotting the landscape. Those poppies, of course, would come to symbolize the human toll of this war. Putting the poppies in the text through Walter's eyes is another way we as readers see how deeply Maud was affected by the war and its symbology.
Walter's letter to Rilla also includes a, quote, "a little scrap of verse" that he wrote one night in his trench dugout. Walter said, "It came to me there. I didn't feel as if I were writing it. Something seemed to use me as an instrument. I've had that feeling once or twice before, but very rarely and never so strongly as this time. That was why I sent it over to the London Spectator. It printed it, and the copy came today. I hope you'll like it. It's the only poem I've written since I came overseas." The poem is a short, poignant little thing, and it becomes an international sensation, copied in newspapers, magazines around the world. It is used in profound reviews and agony columns, in Red Cross appeals and government recruiting propaganda, which makes us think that, like Walter, the poem is not blindly patriotic, but instead attuned to the human toll of the conflict, even if the sacrifice was believed to be justified. Quote, "The whole great heart of humanity caught it up as an epitome of all the pain and hope and pity and purpose of the mighty conflict, crystallized in 3 brief immortal verses. A Canadian lad in the Flanders trenches had written the one great poem of the war. The Piper, by Private Walter Blythe, was a classic from its first printing." Walter becomes renowned for his poem, The Piper, and his poem plays a role similar to that of John McCrae's poem In Flanders Field. Like The Piper, In Flanders Field was an overnight success.
What I think is interesting, though, is so the author of In Flanders Field, John McCrae, he's from Guelph, Ontario. So that would not have been too terribly far from where Maud was living in Leaksdale. But I do wonder if Maud felt like some of that hometown pride at an Ontario boy writing the actual great poem of the war.
I'm sure she did. And you'll notice in the book, when the audiences are responding to someone reciting the Piper, they'll yell something like, "We won't break faith." And that seems to be a specific reference to In Flanders Field, because it has a line in it that says, "The torch be yours to hold it high, if ye break faith with us who die."
Walter was killed instantly at Courcelette, one of the many battles that make up what military historians now call the Battle of the Somme. Rilla receives a letter from Walter after she has already learned that he was gone. Rilla, The piper will pipe me west tomorrow. I feel sure of this. And Rilla, I'm not afraid. I've won my own freedom here, freedom from all fear. I shall never be afraid of anything again, not of death, nor of life, if after all I am to go on living. And life, I think, would be the harder of the two to face, for it could never be beautiful for me again. There would always be such horrible things to remember, things that would make life ugly and painful always for me. I could never forget them, but whether it's life or death, I'm not afraid, Rilla my Rilla, and I am not sorry that I came. I'll never write the poems I once dreamed of writing, but I've helped to make Canada safe for the poets of the future, for the workers of the future, aye, and for the dreamers too. It isn't only the fate of the little seaborne island I love that is in the balance, nor of Canada, nor of England. It's the fate of mankind. That is what we're fighting for, and we shall win. For it isn't only the living who are fighting, the dead are fighting too. Such an army cannot be defeated. You will tell your children of the idea we fought and died for. Teach them it must be lived for as well as died for, else the price paid for it will have been given for naught. This will be part of your work, Rilla. And if you and all the girls back in the homeland do it, then we who don't come back will know that you have not broken faith with us.
Ugh, that is a heavy last letter to leave his sister. It's very clear that Walter's internalized the belief that this war is justified, necessary, maybe even noble. And it seems like that's the only way he could have faced the ugliness of war. And he wants to leave behind a great idea for future generations. But let me ask you guys this. He talks about leaving behind this idea that future generations must continue to protect. What is that idea? That is not articulated very clearly. What was the idea that this war is protecting?
I think that's an excellent question. And it's not answered in the book, but I think it's something that the people who read it at the same time Maud was writing it would have understood, which is, I think, this idea that this was supposed to be the war to end all wars.
Yeah, it's interesting that Maud didn't specifically articulate that idea. That says to me, did she
believe that?
Truly know what the idea was, right? Or believe in it at that time? I don't know. Walter also says that life would be harder for him to face than death would be now. And I think we see that Jem says this, that once Walter got to war, he was never afraid. And Jem was afraid many, many times when he was at war. And that strikes me as someone who is fighting, not expecting to live. Maybe there's a recklessness, fearlessness that is coming from not expecting to protect his own life. I don't know.
So many things are occurring to me. We could go off in so many directions, to think about the way in which he's changed, not to bring it back to Hamlet, but, that was the risk when he invited a Shakespeare scholar on.
a risk we embrace.
So, Hamlet famously said, conscience doth make cowards of us all. Right. And, if you think too much about something, if you have a conscience that leads you to not act, and that's seen as a form of cowardice in Montgomery's time as much as in Shakespeare's time. The implicit corollary of that is that not having a conscience makes you brave. Right. And that's not Walter either. So it seems like he rewires that whole logic so that having a conscience and being brave can kind of peacefully coexist, I guess.
Corey, I think that's exactly right. And of course, at the beginning of our discussion, we talked about how Rilla of Ingleside is about heroism of many kinds. Walter's story is distinct. It's a counterpoint to Jem, a necessary one. Walter earns a medal. He ultimately sacrifices his life for the war effort. So by any definition, he's certainly a hero. But we think Walter's story truly is the heroism that he demonstrates by integrating his conscience into his decision to fight.
Yeah. He's not heroic unknowingly by going into the war so fully aware of what is awaiting him and doing it anyway. That is this almost deeper kind of heroism that Jem perhaps developed throughout the war once he was there. But from the very first moment that Walter enlists, he has done this at this extremely deep level of heroism, of knowing how awful something will be and choosing to do it anyway.
Corey, thank you so much for joining us. And for our Birch Path, Corey is going to talk us through some of the key moments in poetry and art and creativity that arose out of the trenches. So, Corey, I wonder just sort of generally, how did you come to battlefield poetry as an area of interest?
I should start off first by giving your listeners the same disclaimer that I gave to you both when you generously invited me on, and that's that I'm not a professional World War I historian or even literary historian. I'm more of an enthusiastic amateur who's read a lot of the literature and poetry, and I've been fascinated for a long time by how World War I gets remembered or sometimes forgotten in our cultural imagination. For those of us who grew up with boomer parents and greatest generation grandparents, World War II always loomed large, right?
Yes.
I think that's true in general, is especially true for me on a personal level because my Dutch grandmother lived under Nazi occupation. So, I heard a lot about World War II growing up, but when we were growing up, there weren't many surviving World War I vets. So it always seemed very distant and even abstract to me. And so it was really eye-opening to learn about it when I got to high school in world history class, but also from reading All Quiet on the Western Front in sophomore English, and came to realize that the more you learn about World War I, the more you realize that you can't understand World War II without understanding World War I, right? They're just so completely intertwined. But part of the difference in how we remember them, I think, comes from how much easier it is to romanticize World War II. It's thought to be a war with very clear moral imperatives like anti-fascism, anti-genocide, and that it resulted in a decisive victory that seems to, and I really emphasize the seems to, redeem all the losses, right? But in many ways, World War I is the opposite. Notwithstanding all of that final war propaganda, it resists redemptive narratives, even at the time. Siegfried Sassoon, who's a poet we're going to keep coming back to, has a poem called The Poet as Hero, which is certainly resonant with Walter's character, where he describes the war as being driven by lust and senseless hatred. Senseless in the sense of, without direction, without meaning. And historically, that's very accurate. Most people don't know that for most of the war, especially on the Western Front, it was an endless stalemate. There was no progress. There was no advances made by either side. It was just unrelenting gas attacks and mud and rats and mass death and shell shock. Right. So it didn't have that kind of redemptive arc. And certainly it led to more unresolved issues that then had to be repeated and tackled a generation later. So all of that just became very, very fascinating to me. As for the poetry itself, I first encountered it in college, but this was right around the time of 9/11 and the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And against that backdrop, I kind of assumed that the poetry would be sort of mindlessly patriotic, like the stuff printed on recruitment posters. And I often tell my students that true learning happens in moments of surprise when you encounter something unexpected. And I found, to my great surprise, I was not looking forward to reading, battlefield poetry. That's not my thing. But I found that the poetry is just so much more varied and nuanced than I had anticipated. Of course, some of it is very patriotic, like in Flanders Fields, which is practically Canadian scripture, or the sonnets of Rupert Brooke, which give these very lush and idealized visions of noble sacrifice. But then you have the poets who wrote from the trenches, people like Siegfried Sassoon and Wilfred Owen, who give really graphic and unflinching descriptions of what the war actually looked and felt like to the people who were fighting it. Gas victims drowning in their own lungs. That leaves an impression on you when you read images like that. And so those poems, by contrast, are very anti-mythologizing.
Corey, I would love for you to maybe share some of the poems that particularly stand out for you, or maybe some of the ones that you think kind of relate back to our discussion about Walter today.
so many of the poems and the poetry in general and the poets in general, I was thinking about when I was reading Rilla of Ingleside and focusing on Walter's character. One thing I do want to say is kind of before we get into specific poems is a more general comment. Actually, two general comments. One is that when I first read the poetry, I was really struck by how formally playful and experimental some of the poems were. So just to take one example, Sassoon has a poem called The General, which is written in anapestic tetrameter, which is a meter usually used in children's poetry, like Dr. Seuss, you're off to great places. Today is your day. Your mountain is waiting, so get on your way. And that sing-songy rhythm makes it all the more bitterly ironic that the poem ends with soldiers dying because of the titular general's incompetence, right? So the form of the poem is itself kind of enacting the satire. And that's not something that you would think about when you're thinking about battlefield poetry, right?
There's something about the rhythm of that meter where it's just like, it sounds like marching.
Well, it sounds like marching, but it sounds like children marching, right? That kind of skipping march that kids would do when they are playing, right? Not like a grim march. Oh,
exactly.
The way kids would march to follow the piper.
To build on what you're saying, the ancient Homeric epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, are written in a meter called dactylic hexameter, which is kind of the inverse of the anapest. So the dactyl is a stressed syllable followed by two unstressed syllables. So it's like dun 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 dun, right? Whereas the anapest is two unstressed syllables followed by a stressed syllable. So it's dun 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 dun. And so they're mirror inverses of each other, but the dactylic meter is usually used in poems about war, and the anapestic meter is usually used in kind of children's verse. But I think they're connected, right? Because they're flipped. And so it's all the more interesting that Sassoon uses the anapestic meter for this particular poem. But another thing I wanted to say too, and maybe this is a little far-fetched, but I'm hoping that you'll indulge me. I encountered the poetry in college, and then I have a friend from grad school, Jeff Covington, who actually studied World War I poetry. And he really got me thinking more about the queerness of this body of work. Sassoon and Wilfred Owen were both gay. They met at the Craig Lockhart War Hospital in Edinburgh, and their poetry is filled with male tenderness and longing and grief and emotional intensity. I was texting with Jeff last week, and he reminded me that there's a really important book about the literary history of World War I called The Great War in Modern Memory by Paul Fussell, which your listeners might be interested in reading. And that has a whole chapter on gay soldiers and their friendships and relationships. And Fussell, in that chapter, he quotes a passage from, of all things, Thomas Pynchon's Gravity's Rainbow, where Pynchon writes, quote, "In the trenches of the First World War, English men came to love one another decently, without shame or make-believe, under the easy likelihoods of their sudden deaths, and to find in the faces of other young men evidence of otherworldly visits, some poor hope that may have helped redeem even mud, shit, and the decaying pieces of human meat. While Europe died meanly in its own wastes, men loved." I also bring that up in this context because even though Walter is more or less certifiably heterosexual, we queer readers are often adept at reading between the lines. And it's hard not to see in Walter's sensitivity and what is called his queer visions, the seeds of a potential queerness in the more specific sense of that word. I'm not saying that he's actually a closeted gay character, but there's a kind of aesthetic queerness that I think aligns him with poets like Sassoon and Owen. But maybe I'm just overanalyzing.
No. Well, he's not also.
Yes,
right?
Exactly.
So, and actually, one of the premier Ella Montgomery scholars, Benjamin Lefebvre, wrote a paper called Walter's Closet. Kind of about this idea of, again, right, like what's coded. And I haven't read it in depth because I don't have one of those subscriptions that let you read all those academic papers behind paywall. Yeah. I think that is often something that is talked about around Walter. All these references about him being Miss Walter, around assumptions of, even from his housekeeper, Susan, who loves him dearly, says she hopes the war beats the poetry out of him.
Even the idea that no one at Ingleside expects him to fight, that he's not meant for war. I think that's also queer-coded as well.
Absolutely. So one of the things that I wanted to talk about, I tended to gravitate more, as I'm probably suggesting, toward the more satirical and, cynical poetry. But that raises a lot of questions. And so I discovered the poetry in college. And then when I got to Fordham, I, for a while, was teaching a class called How Poems Work. And one of the poems I always assign was Siegfried Sassoon's poem, Glory of Women. It's really a difficult poem, not in terms of whether it's easy or difficult to understand, but it raises so many questions. And just to kind of give some context in relation to Rilla of Ingleside, something I really loved about the book is that it offers a very different angle on the war. Most canonical World War I literature, especially the poetry, is written from the trenches by men. But Montgomery, she instead focuses on the home front, and especially on women's activities during the war, the knitting, the rationing, the recruitment drives, the fundraising, the emotional labor. And Walter has that heartbreaking line to Rilla where he says, quote, "Be awfully good to mother while I'm away. It must be a horrible thing to be a mother in this war. The mothers and sisters and wives and sweethearts have the hardest times." And that's a really significant moment because, one, it speaks to Walter's capacity for empathy and imagining perspectives that are different from his own. But it also reminds us that war literature has often privileged the experience of the soldier. And not without reason. They were the ones on the front. But in reality, the psychic burden on women, the waiting, as Walter puts it, the not knowing, is its own form of devastation. So that's kind of the background. Sassoon's poem, Glory of Women, which I always love teaching, is a really interesting counterpoint to that, because he starts off accusing women, the women at home, of worshiping soldiers' medals and of romanticizing the war from a safe distance. So the opening of the poem is, "You love us when we're heroes, home on leave, or wounded in a mentionable place. You worship decorations. You believe that chivalry redeems the war's disgrace." And then comes the most lacerating and resonant line in all of World War I poetry. And, I used to just delight in asking my students to unpack all the meanings of this line. He writes, "You make us shells." And on the surface, that refers to the literal work that many women did in munitions factories, very literal way, right? But metaphorically, it also suggests that the women make the soldiers into shells of their former selves, right? To be made a shell is to be hollowed out, emptied of humanity, turned into something that exists only as a thing, to be exploded. So Sassoon is suggesting that
the women are making them shells to hold their romanticized version of the war, the women's romanticized version of the war.
Exactly. So, Sassoon is in all these ways, in that all the meanings condensed in those four words, he's, suggesting that the home front idealizes soldiers in a way that strips them of their inner lives and their nuance and their fragility, right? But a lot of readers have seen this poem as somewhat misogynistic. The second person you is very accusatory, and the whole poem paints women as consumers of soldierly suffering. And at first glance, there's no acknowledgement that women also grieved and feared and suffered losses, right? So that's where we're at. But then, as if that weren't already complicated enough, the poem takes this really odd turn at the very end. It comes almost out of nowhere in the form of an apostrophe addressed to a German mother, It ends by saying, "Oh, German mother, dreaming by the fire, while you are knitting socks to send your son, his face is trodden deeper in the mud." Mic drop, right? Like, there's so much to unpack there, but it's interesting that the poem does end by reaffirming the tender love that women, and especially mothers, showed, but also reaffirming the futility of that care, right? Like, you're knitting the socks, but your son is face down in mud, but also dissolving the national boundaries by showing that both sides suffered losses. So it's a poem that takes all these twists and turns and really encapsulates all of the kinds of tension that you see in the poetry and in World War I. And maybe more implicitly, but in Rilla of Ingleside too.
I think explicitly in Rilla of
Yeah.
Ingleside.
Well, and I was thinking a little bit when we were talking about the line, you make us shells, and it being accusatory, but also like maybe towards women. But I also think about the women's experience of all of the pressure about how they are not supposed to send their men to war crying, that the last thing they see is their women smiling bravely, that they are supposed to be this beautiful, selfless, perfect thing that brings strength and hearten the men, to give them this image to fight for. And that is dehumanizing as well, right? It's making women, it certainly made Rilla an idea for Ken to fight for, but didn't make her a real person to him.
It goes both ways. And that's something that's probably why many readers and scholars have read Glory of Women as an almost kind of sexist, unfairly sexist attack on the women, right? But, Sassoon is the most cynical of them all. And, he really brings out the downsides to patriotism. Another poem of his that I was really reminded of when I was reading Rilla is he has a poem called They, where the word they in the title has scare quotes around it. And I was thinking, I'll read the poem in a moment, but I was thinking a lot of that exchange between Mr. Meredith and Norman at the end of chapter 5, where Norman, the atheist, right, kind of calls out how the usual pastoral platitudes feel hollow against the scale of suffering. Sassoon's poem, They, kind of does something similar. I'll just read it because it's so good. The bishop tells us, when the boys come back, they will not be the same, for they'll have fought in a just cause. They lead the last attack on Antichrist. Their comrades' blood has bought new right to breed an honorable race. They have challenged death and dared him face to face. We're none of us the same, the boys reply, for George lost both his legs and Bill's stone blind. Poor Jim shot through the lungs and like to die, and Bert's gone syphilitic. You'll not find a chap who served that hasn't found some change. And the bishop said, the ways of God are strange.
Rough.
Very, very rough.
Wow.
It's criticizing this bishop that tells soldiers that the war will ennoble them, and the soldiers answer that actually what they're getting is blindness and amputation and trauma. And the poem ends with the bishop insisting in this totally empty way that their sacrifices are God's work. And the bitterness of that line, I think, exposes how disconnected institutional religion had become from the lived reality of war. And you see that played out kind of in Rilla of Ingleside as well.
Right. Yeah, very much so. I mean, there's nothing that Reverend Meredith can say.
I don't think that Montgomery is that cynical. I was thinking a lot about something that Reagan said, I think, all the way back in one of the first episodes, that you can't be cynical and be a reader of Ella Montgomery, or maybe it was vice versa. You can't be a reader of Ella Montgomery and be cynical. I think that this novel clearly tests the limits of that, but I don't think she's as cynical as Sassoon by any measure. But I do think she is similarly alert to the way that moral language gets strained under pressure. And Walter's story,
experiencing that as a minister's wife, right? She has her parishioners coming to her saying, we're worried about our sons are dead, our sons are missing, our sons are injured. We don't know what's happening with our sons. And what can she say?
Exactly. And she was deeply conflicted, I think, even more so after the war, about her role as a minister's wife in recruitment, and then seeing the aftermath of men coming back broken and boys that she knew dying or being injured in catastrophic ways, and that being something she very much struggled with later in her life.
Corey, I'm wondering, as well, as you are reflecting on sort of your study of these poems, where are you seeing similarities to Walter's The Piper? Of the poems you've read, where do you see some overlap and some of the similar themes?
Yeah, based on how it's presented in the novel, I mean, it would seem to align more with McCrae and Rupert Brooke, the kind of more blatantly patriotic of the poems. But I think that one of the most painful ironies in Rilla of Ingleside is that his poem becomes this patriotic anthem, right? That not just the community and not just the nation, but the whole world turns it into a symbol of noble sacrifice. But we know that the poem came out of Walter's fear and his hesitation and his sense of doom. And so there's that irreconcilable gap between what the poem meant to him and what it means to us as readers knowing the backstory versus what it comes to mean publicly, right? And in a way that kind of echoes what happened to some of the real war poets, like someone like Wilfred Owen, like Walter. He struggled for months before enlisting, and his poems make clear how even though he fought and suffered, he also intensely rejected the patriotic cliches of his time. But once a culture needs heroes, it strips away all of that ambiguity and all of that ambivalence. And I think that Montgomery really captures that process with Walter, right? The private agony that produces the art gets erased and the art gets repurposed as almost propaganda. And I think that tension is part of what makes him, like so many of the other actual poets, a really moving and tragic figure.
Corey, if our listeners want to read one of Wilfred Owen's poems, which would you recommend?
Dulce et decorum est. That's his most famous, and for good reason. I mean, it's a really harrowing description of being in the trenches, and probably his most powerful argument against those patriotic cliches.
Dulce et decorum est in Latin means it is right and just. Am I correct? Is that translation correct?
Sweet and just. Yeah, it's part of a line from Horace's Odes where it's dulce et decorum est in pro. I should have written this down in preparation.
Pro patria mori.
Yeah, so it's sweet and just to die for one's country. And he ends that poem by referring to that as the great lie. And it's interesting that the title casts off the pro patria mori, right? And it's just dulce et decorum est.
Which means, right, just it is sweet and just.
Exactly.
That's so interesting. Oh my gosh, Corey, I am so glad you were able to come and do this with us because I just feel like my mind is kind of blown open on some of these things and that I hadn't known before, and it giving new and interesting context to this book.
Well, thank you. I mean, the reverse is certainly true too. I've just learned so much from both of you, from the podcast as a whole and from this episode, and I cannot thank you both enough.
This has been fantastic. Let's move to kind of wind up our episode. We often do inspired by Anne, but in this episode, of course, we are inspired by Walter. So Corey, do you have something you're inspired by?
I do. So my recommendation is Pat Barker's novel Regeneration, which was published in the early 90s. It's one of the most moving novels about the kind of psychological toll of World War I. It's set at Craig Lockhart, the war hospital that I mentioned earlier, where shell-shocked soldiers were treated. And it weaves together real historical figures, including Siegfried Sassoon and Wilfred Owen. It weaves them together with fictional characters. So it's not a battlefield novel. It's more about the medical treatment of the aftermath, but it really captures in beautiful and harrowing ways one of the key predicaments of the war, which it was, how do you treat someone just enough to send them back into the very situation that broke them, which is just a contradiction and a paradox that is just that many of the soldiers face.
Right. And we see that in this book when Jerry Meredith is knocked unconscious and is immediately, after like a day in the hospital, he's immediately sent back to the front.
Yeah.
Kelly, do you have a recommendation?
So my recommendation is the movie 1917. This is a movie that was directed by Sam Mendes. It's relatively recent. It's about two World War I soldiers who are delivering an urgent message across enemy lines. I'm not a war movie person at all, but this is a good one. It was filmed in one take, which is a very kind of cool concept. And because of that, it is immersive and enthralling. It really is just like propulsive. Like you were just sucked right in right off the bat. And it also underscores the brutality of this war in a very, very intense and personal way. And to tie it back to this episode particularly, it does a really wonderful job of showing the acts of tremendous bravery and humanity and friendship and love among the men who were fighting the war, while also underscoring just like the pointlessness of the war overall. So the story is fictional, but all the situations are real because it was inspired by Sam Mendes' grandfather's stories of fighting in World War I. Reagan, what were you inspired by this week?
So I'm going to recommend this absolutely fascinating book I just finished. It's The Everlasting by Alex E. Harrow. And you might not, at first glance, think that this fantasy book about a female knight in a fantasy world has anything to do with World War I, but it absolutely does. Because this book is also a time travel love story about a former soldier who considers himself a coward, just as Walter does. And the action alternates between a modern fantasy world that's sort of analogous to Europe after World War II, or between World War I and World War II. It's a fantasy world. This world's fantastical history, which has sort of an Arthurian type legend of Una the Everlasting. And there is so much in there about the toll of war on individuals, heroic or not, on communities and nations, about the lies we tell ourselves and the lies we tell to others to justify war. It is amazing. And I did not know when I picked it up this weekend just how much it would tie into Walter's story. But there are connections all over the place. I mean, I picked it up because y'all know I love A Lady Knight, thanks to my childhood obsession with Alana by Tamara Pierce. You know, Alex E. Harrow writes incredible books that, while technically maybe fantasy, it feels like they kind of utterly defy genre. And The Everlasting is incredible. I kept wanting to both read faster because I was so compelled and slow down so I could relish reading it and not finish it too fast. So please go read that.
Corey, thank you so much for joining us. If our listeners want to learn more about your scholarship, read more of your work, where can they find you?
So the best place is the Fordham English Department website. I have a faculty page that has my contact information and, you know, descriptions of my research and teaching. So that would be the best place.
Excellent. Well, we will put that link in our show notes,
along with links to the poems that you taught us about today. I think that our listeners are really, really going to get a lot out of experiencing those for themselves. Thank you so much, friend, for being here. This has been absolutely delightful.
Thank you. I admire and adore you both. And this was just a wonderful, wonderful experience.
Oh, thank you.
We are so grateful to everyone who's been listening and sharing the podcast.
Yeah, truly. The messages and reviews mean the world to us. Knowing that this podcast, that is such a labor of love, is finding people who are, and it's meaning something to you. We absolutely love hearing from you.
So if you haven't yet, you can rate us 5 stars wherever you listen. It does help more kindred spirits find our cozy little corner of the internet.
And still, if you email us about your review at kindredspirits.bookclub@gmail.com, we will send you a sticker and a thank you note. Thank you for listening.
Thanks, kindred spirits.